Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the final Q&A session for the Western Victoria Transmission Network project. My name is Amy Ann Hubbard, and I'll be your independent moderator for tonight's webinar. My role tonight is to assist you pose your question to the panel, get through as many questions as possible, and keep us on time and on track. Before we commence this webinar, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands where we are located today, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this webinar. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and recognise and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of Australia. Tonight, I'll be joined by a panel of experts from the project team to answer your questions. And shortly, I'll ask the panelists to introduce themselves. For those who have attended one of these webinars previously, welcome back. And for those who are attending for the first time, welcome, and we hope you find tonight's session informative. So just another update regarding COVID-19. Our team tonight had planned to be in the same office to facilitate this webinar. But with the reintroduction of the restrictions in metropolitan Melbourne, each of us are in our own homes. We apologise in advance if we have any connection issues, any disruptions or surprises. Please be patient and we'll work through this together. So tonight's agenda is simple. We'll have a short presentation on the project, a Q&A process to answer as many questions as our time permits, so please keep sending in those questions to us. We'll be finishing at 8 p.m. You're welcome to stay for a short while or for the duration of the webinar. When leaving the webinar, you'll be automatically directed to an evaluation survey, and we encourage you to fill it out and let us know about your experience. So just in terms of housekeeping, all microphones are muted except panelists to reduce background noise and distractions. Our sessions are being recorded and will be consolidated and shared via the website. Questions can be asked via the questions and answer tool in the tab in the middle of your screen, or you can email them to info@westvicnp.com.au. Please write your question as succinctly as possible and include your name and area if you wish it to be read out. So the questions that we don't get through today will be uploaded to the website with the response, and where possible, they will be responded to. Any offensive language included in questions will not be read out, and the panel members will answer the questions the best they can, or they'll take the questions on notice. So just a note, we did invite people to submit video questions. I think we've received one to date, and we expect to receive a couple more, or at least a handful more over the next hour or two. So please send your questions into us, and we'd be really happy to read them out and hopefully answer them tonight. So to aid in structuring tonight's time, we will cluster the discussion into topics like we have at other sessions. So just to run through quickly, the topics are route selection and project background, infrastructure, bushfire health, visual impact, compensation, community benefit, community engagement, and any other questions that you may have. So now I would like each of the panelists to introduce themselves and the role on the project. So over to you, Francisco.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Francisco Vizcaino, and I am the project director for the Western Victoria Transmission Network project.
Thank you. And over to Tara.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Tara Horsnell. I'm the Planning and Environment Lead for the project.
And Ash.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Ashley Clifton. I'm the Project Development Manager for the Western Victoria Transmission Network project.
And Paul.
Yes, good evening, everyone. My name's Paul Ower, and I'm the Land and Easement Assembly Lead for the project.
Thank you, Paul. And last but not least, Dennis.
Evening, everyone. Dennis McCrone. I'm the Integration Manager for the project.
Thanks, everyone. And thanks again to everyone attending tonight, whether you're at home, or probably you're all at home, but whether you're a panelist or a community member. Let's get started. So I'm now going to hand over to Francisco to provide us with a welcome and to talk us through the project.
Okay, thank you, Amy. I will start before we look at this timeline diagram in detail. I will start giving a bit of the context or the background about why we are building this. Where is the rationale behind the project? The Victorian electricity network is constrained and requires an expansion. The reason for that is that the Victorian grid was designed back several decades ago to transport electricity mainly from the Latrobe Valley, from the brown coal fired power plants into metropolitan Melbourne and then out to the regions. Once those power plants are decommissioned and they will be in the foreseeable future, there is going to be a need to integrate more renewable energy into the grid to compensate for the loss of that brown coal generation. We are lucky enough in Victoria that we have a world-class renewable energy resource, both wind and solar, and that resource is the best of that resource is in Western Victoria. That's the reason why we need to strengthen the grid to facilitate the integration of all that renewable energy into the network. In terms of what we are exactly planning to build here, starting from west, and I will go from west towards east, we will build a transmission line 220 kV, 220 kilovolt transmission line that will run from the existing Bulgana terminal station all the way down to the Wobra terminal station. From there to a location to be determined somewhere north of Ballarat and on top of or adjacent to the existing Ballarat to Bendigo transmission line. From there, we will be building a 500 kV transmission line that will go from that location to be determined somewhere north of Ballarat to Sydenham, to the existing Sydenham terminal station in northwest suburban Melbourne. And we will also expand that Sydenham terminal station to accommodate for that new transmission line that will be coming in. Now looking at the diagram that we have on the screen, for the next 2 years, approximately, we will be focusing on stakeholder engagement, land assembly, land and easements assembly, and all the planning and approvals process. We forecast that to take until mid-2022 approximately, and by that time, mid-2022, mid to late 2022, we would commence construction with the intention to finalize the construction of the entire project by late 2024. If we move on to the next slide, please. Again, this is a bit of a summary of what we are going to be doing in the next year or year and a half, couple of years. At the moment, we've commenced the engagement with local councils and with state government. We moved then into contact with landowners and with the community. We will go through all that process of the planning approvals, which run through several streams, Commonwealth government, state government, cultural heritage, and with the intention again to complete that process in mid to late 2022 before we commence construction. Next slide, please. So the main concern, or one of the main concerns from the community and landowners to date has been the question of why is this project an overhead transmission line? There are 3 main reasons why this project has been conceived as an overhead transmission line as opposed to an underground cable. The first one is that an overhead transmission line is the standard in Australia and in the rest of the world for transmission lines of this rating and this capacity. there are very few examples of transmission lines, especially on the 500 kV rating or voltage around the world that are built underground. And those that are so for a very short length, in the order of a few kilometers at the most, and for very specific reasons to avoid certain urban environments or other specific features. That's the first reason. It's a standard across the world. Second one is that the impact, the environmental impact of an underground line would be much, much greater than that from an overhead line. An underground cable requires the digging of quite a wide trench and deep trench all the way through in order to put the cable in there. That means on top of that, on top of the trench that the cable itself is located in, there is a need for a number of joint pits, which are the places where the cables are joined together. Those joint pits are required every 500, 600, 700 meters, depending on the type of cable. So for a project like this, where we expect that the total length of the line will be in the order of 200 kilometers, we would be talking about doing the number 600 to 700 of those. The size of those joint pits depend again on the specific details of the design, but we would be looking at the size of a medium swimming pool. So it may be 10 to 15 meters long, 20 meters long, 10 to 12 meters wide, 5 meters deep, in that order of magnitude. Those joint pits also require permanent access. So access roads, permanent access roads need to be built to allow for, for the maintenance on the inspection of those pits. All of this altogether adds up to a much greater ground disturbance of an underground cable relative to an overhead transmission line. For an overhead transmission line, the footprint or the ground disturbance is limited to the close environment around the base of the tower, which may be an area of during construction of say 70 by 70 meters, something like that at the most. But once it's built, it's limited to the square formed by the footings, the 4 footings of the tower. That additional or increased footprint of an underground line means that the impact on things like native vegetation, fauna habitats, cultural and historic heritage is much greater. It's a continuous trench dug all the way in the middle of, or would be a continuous trench dug in the middle of regional Victoria. Also the impact on the use of land. Very limited agricultural practices can be continued on top of an underground cable. There are also impacts on groundwater, given, it's a continuous trench being dug. In summary, much greater environmental impact from an underground cable. And the third reason why this is planned as an overhead transmission line is the cost. The cost of an underground cable is in the order of an order of magnitude greater than an overhead line. We've seen references, independent references from the United States that indicate that the additional cost of an underground cable relative to an overhead line would be in the order to between 4 to 14 times the cost, depending on the rating. Given these transmission lines are on the larger part of the scale in terms of ratings, that would be probably closer to the 14 than the 4. At the end of the day, this project is funded by the Victorian electricity consumers. So the economically sustainable solution for a project of this scale is an overhead solution, an overhead transmission line, as opposed to a much more expensive underground cable. In the next slide, please, I have an example of what the construction of an underground cable looks like. This photo is taken from a project in Germany, which is the undergrounding of a 375 kV cable. We can see how it's not only the size of the trench itself, is the footprint required to complete the construction. which is much wider than the trench itself. Again, think about this happening on a continuous line of 200 kilometers in regional Victoria. On the next slide, there was also there is significant concern about the visual impact of the transmission lines that will be built as part of this project. So I went on Google Earth Street View and tried to find some examples of how those transmission lines look like in real life examples. So some of those are already installed. This is regional Western Victoria. I think it's near Cressy, and we can see those are the two of the 500 kV towers, pretty much identical to the ones that we would be building for this project. This is a scene from 300 meters. Next one, please. It's the same towers seen from a 500-meter distance. And the next one, please, from 1 kilometer. On the next slide, this is what a completed terminal station looks like. So this is similar to the one that we would be building in a location north of Ballarat, to be determined. And this photo was taken before the landscaping had been completed. So this station has been surrounded by a vegetation screening. So some bushes and trees have been planted around it to kind of merge it with the surrounding landscape. And also one point I would like to make is that this is how the towers and all those steel structures look like when they are just installed, when they are brand new. They lose that reflectiveness after a few months, and they are less shiny. And again, that helps merging the visuals into the landscape. This is the Haunted Gully Terminal Station near Lismore in Western Victoria. Next slide, please. I tried to find an example of a 220 kV tower, similar, if not almost identical to the ones that we would be building for this project. This photo is taken in Laverton North, and it's approximately 8 meters from the base of the towers where this was taken. Next one, please. The purpose of this photo was to show that agricultural practices can continue underneath an overhead transmission line. So this photo shows 4 transmission line towers, the 500 kV towers again. The distance between them, I think I measured it, and it's 450 meters from each other. And we can see the plow lines there. One member of the community in one of the previous sessions pointed out that this is a very specific type of agricultural or farming activity. And just we know that it's not. We are not saying that everything is possible underneath transmission lines. There are certain limitations, but we wanted to show an example of farming continuing under an overhead transmission line. Next photo, please. Again, same thing, trying to find a photo of a 500 kV tower from the closest point possible. I think this is 100 or 120 meters from the base of the tower. Same area in Western Victoria. Next one, please. Another of the major concerns from the community that we've heard so far is about the health impacts of transmission lines in people who live in the vicinity of transmission lines. This is an example of suburban Melbourne, Listerfield. There is a corridor there that hosts 7 transmission lines. So looking at the photo, the blue lines are 66 kV lines, the purple ones are 220 kV, and the orange ones are 500. This corridor runs for quite a number of kilometers, and what we wanted to illustrate here is that there are tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people in Melbourne who live in the vicinity of transmission lines with no recorded impacts on health or well-being that we know of. This area is not fenced at all. You can see in the photo that there are tracks and roads that go underneath, and it's parkland, and people can traverse this area freely, and again, no recorded impacts on health or well-being that we know of. Next slide, please. This is a map of the area of interest. Again, going back to the what we are building here from Volcana Terminal Station to Wobra Terminal Station, we intend to build a new transmission line in parallel and adjacent to the existing one. That's why the area of interest is narrower in that part of the alignment. That's because we intend to take advantage of the existing infrastructure there. Also because of, as per the best practice for design, environmentally conscious design of transmission lines, a new line should always be built in proximity and parallel to an existing one, and maintaining the stepping, which means that the new towers are built right next to the existing ones when possible. From Wobra to the east, the area of interest widens because there is we don't know where that terminal station is going to be. Again, it has to be between Ballarat Terminal Station and between the line, adjacent to the line that goes from Ballarat Terminal Station to Bendigo, and that's that blue line there. From that location to be determined, then we need to connect to Sydenham Terminal Station, and again the area of interest is much wider in there because there is no clear alignment or pathway or corridor easement that may be readily available for this project. Next slide, please. We are aware that the project is causing distress in the community, and that in order to respond to that, we've partnered with the Benestar Group, which is the provider that currently provides AusNet with their employee assistance program. This is a partner that we've worked with and we trust. We wouldn't have any, this is going to be online or available on Monday the 20th of July, next week. There will be a phone number in the project website, and this service may be accessed by any distressed members of the community. We will have no visibility whatsoever about who's contacting that. It will be completely, we will never know anything about the people contacting this service. This service will be provided by health professionals qualified and experienced with a minimum of 5 years experience. And again, I want to emphasize that we will not act as a filter or intermediary here. It will be direct contact and a direct service between the provider that we have engaged and the members of the community who may need to access this service. And I think that's all for this introduction. And we may now move on to take questions. Amy?
Thanks very much, Francisco, and thank you for the additional information about Benestar. So that is new information that's come to hand through the course of these webinars, but it will be up on the website from next week. So we are going to move into the Q&A part of this evening. We've got a little over an hour and a half, and we've got a number of themes to get through. I'll just reiterate what they are. We've got route selection, infrastructure, bushfire and health, visual impact, compensation and community benefit, community engagement, and any other questions that you have. I've had a look at some of the questions coming through. There's some similar themes from previous webinars. There's some new questions. There's quite a lot of questions, which is great. And at the moment, there's 65 of us participating in the webinar tonight. So thank you all for being here. The first question tonight is the video that was sent to us, I think today. It was sent by Jane Neville. So we're going to play that now.
Hello, I'm Jane Neville, and this is our home in Wattle Flat, site of a proposed easement. Can you please provide examples, Australian preferably, of similar sized, similar scale projects going through bushland? I have asked this question before, but really would like it answered. Can you also please provide photographs before and after these examples? Thank you.
Thanks, Jane, for taking the time to send that through to us. It's great receiving them by video. Get to see some human faces other than the other panellists here tonight. No offence, panellists. Francisco, did you want to respond in the first instance to Jane's question? Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you for your question. I will try my best not to use the word holistic, because I know that you don't like that question, that word. Examples of transmission lines of this size going through forest or bushland. There are a few in Victoria. There are the 500 kV transmission line that goes from the Latrobe Valley into Melbourne has several sections that run through forest. Also, the transmission line, I think it's a 370 kV transmission line that goes all the way to New South Wales, goes through a national park, if I remember correctly. And Paul, correct me if I'm wrong. Those lines, I've been trying to find some photos from Google Earth, and I will try to spend some time providing those to you. What we cannot provide are the before photos, because those projects or those transmission lines were built decades ago. So we will try and find photos specifically, because you were asking for Australian examples. We will find the Victorian examples. Unfortunately, I don't think we will be able to provide the before photos, but we will give you examples. And again, this will be coming from Google Earth. I can even point you to the exact locations of the places where I will be taking the screenshots, and you will see those are real examples in Victoria.
Okay, thanks, Francisco. Now we are moving on to the questions that have been emailed to us, but also provided to us through the Q&A function in the middle of your screen. So the first theme, kind of leading on from the first question, is route selection. So we've got a question that's come via email from Mary Ann. What is the current route locations? When will this be finalised? Francisco, is that you?
I will let us answer this one.
I can answer that one, Amy. So thank you for the question. At this stage, the project is at the start of the process, and we don't have a transmission route selected yet. We have the area of interest, which is on our website, and we're currently working through gathering information across that broad area of interest to understand the area in greater detail, understand the existing conditions, the existing environments, and the areas and the values that are important to the community. And from there, we will work to refine the area of interest down to a smaller and narrower project corridor. But at this stage, given we're at the start of the process, we don't have a transmission corridor or a transmission route selected yet.
Thanks, Ash. There's another question that's sort of leading on from your response there. It's from Andrea. What criteria is used for the route selection?
Yeah, look, in terms of how we would narrow down the area of interest, there's a number of aspects that we look at. And as I mentioned, a really important one is the information and the feedback from the communities within the area of interest. But we will also look to understand the existing conditions of the environment and the landscape. And these include aspects such as biodiversity, cultural heritage, historic heritage. We will look at aspects such as surface and groundwater, aviation. We'll do land use and agricultural use studies, look at bushfire, look at landscape and visual impacts, planning and social as well. So there's a whole range of different studies and different assessments and investigations that that are undertaken to enable at the end of the day, the final project corridor and the final transmission route that gets determined to avoid impacts and minimise impacts to a acceptable level.
Thanks, Ash. I've got another question here from Mary Ann. I think it's probably leading on from the presentation this evening, but can the power lines be put underground? If not, why not? If it is cost, then why are health and environmental concerns not more important than economic? Is that you, Francisco?
Again, the health impacts from an underground cable would be of the same order, which probably would be negligible, because the underground cable would be built to the same or a similar level of rigor and standard and strict guidelines. But on the environmental aspect, that's where the underground cable is much more impactful. As I was describing before, the building an underground cable has, except on the visual impact, all of the rest are much greater for an underground cable.
And maybe if I can add to that as well, Francisco, a really important difference for underground cables is that, and this is the requirement for why open cut trenching is needed, is that different to, say, underground water pipes or gas pipelines, is the underground electrical cables need to be completely surrounded by material such as sand that has specific thermal properties to allow the heat to escape the cable. Now, the only way to place the cable and surround it by this material or this sand is to have open cut trenching. Now, for a project such as Western Victoria, if that was to be underground, about 50% of the soil that was taken out would need to be taken away from site and replaced with this material or sand that has these particular thermal properties. Now, just to give an idea on what that sort of means, if you were to compare underground versus overhead, the volume of soil that would need to be removed approximately for an overhead solution would be in the order of sort of 80,000 cubic metres. For an underground solution, it's just under 880,000 cubic metres that would need to be taken away from site and the equivalent brought back in of a different material. Now, that relates to a sort of a comparison. If you look at the amount of truck movements that would be required to cut that material out and bring in the additional material, for an overhead, you're looking at around 5,500 truck movements approximately. But for an underground solution, that number is over 58,000 truck movements. So there are some real unique differences for underground cable solutions compared to other underground infrastructure, such as pipelines or gas pipelines.
Thanks, Ash. The next question is, it must be from a landowner. Will we be notified before April 2022 of the preferred line path? It's a long time to be worrying about the possibility of it being installed on my property.
Look, I can answer that one as well, Amy. As we refine the area of interest down to the project corridor, once we have undertaken that process, we'll definitely be letting the community know, and we'll be engaging and communicating that refined area. From there, as we work through the planning and approvals process and the anticipated environmental impact assessments, at the completion of that process, the relevant documentation detailing the final proposed infrastructure location or transmission line route will be made public for everyone, for the communities to review and to provide comment on. Thanks,
Ash. The next question is from Timothy. Is there not existing infrastructure you could use and upgrade, but the issue is that a competitor privately owns it?
Look, a good question. Within the area of interest, there's no existing transmission infrastructure. or transmission lines for the 500 kV section of the project. There is existing infrastructure for the 200 kV section. So, and as Francisco already mentioned, the project is intending to locate a section of the new 220 kV transmission line between Bulgana and Waubra adjacent to an existing line. But particularly within the 500 kV portion of the project, there's existing infrastructure corridors such as road or rail, but there isn't any existing transmission infrastructure corridors in that part of the area of interest.
Thanks, Ash. We've got a question from Mark. It's an email. Why don't you go south from Bulgana terminal station to the terminal station near Lismore and link into the transmission lines there? It's only 100 kilometres and it is mainly grasslands. This means you don't have to destroy landscapes and you are not creating a problem for local fire brigades.
Well, the scope of this project, the requirements of this project are to connect Bulgana and Waubra, then connect with the existing Ballarat to Bendigo line, and then connect into Sydenham. That is the scope of the project, and the connection between Bulgana and the new terminal station needs to be 220, and the connection between the new terminal station and Sydenham needs to be 500. Those are the parameters that we are working with. That's the scope of the project.
Okay. All right, the next question, how many hectares will be claimed for the North Ballarat terminal station?
Paul, can you talk about that?
Yes, I can. Sorry, I was just unmuting there. The minimum requirement we have there is for a 50 hectare lot. We are, with some land in that area, obviously allotments are larger, and in those circumstances, we will be working with landowners to establish the minimum requirement of 50, but I believe some of the land parcels through there up to just over 100 hectares. So, but the minimum requirement we have is for a 50 hectare, and that does allow us to provide screening around there to minimise visual impact as well. The footprint of the actual station itself, I believe, is around about 550 by about 350 metres for the ultimate layout.
Okay, another question regarding the terminal station. Ballarat Council has received notification regarding siting of the Ballarat North terminal station. Will this be made public via council or via AusNet? And is the land expected to be compulsorily acquired? Can't get the word out. You know what I'm saying, Paul?
Yep. Thanks, Amy. I'm not quite sure where that information's come from, but obviously I'd be more than happy to engage further. We've been very open in the fact that we haven't acquired a terminal station site. So the siting of that, as we've said on the map we showed earlier, there's an area that we're investigating that is underneath the Ballarat to Bendigo line. It extends about 25 kilometres north of the Western Highway. We're speaking to, I think we've made contact or reached out to everyone within reasonable proximity of either side of that line. The station does have to be located abutting to that to allow that line to tie in. We have not bought a terminal station site. We are working and in discussions with numerous landowners down there to try to seek a negotiated solution there. In relation to the question about compulsory acquisition, that's a circumstance we're hoping to avoid. We do need to obviously make applications whenever we use statutory powers, and we are trying to enter into a negotiated solution, which we are hoping to be able to achieve in the very near future.
Okay, Paul, so just back to that question, Ballarat Council has received notification, so that's not the case?
Well, not from myself. Okay. So we haven't acquired a site, so we would have relayed to Ballarat Council, the City Council there, that we had that area of investigation. As I said, I'd be more than happy to take that on board, and happy to speak to where that has originated from.
Yeah, okay. It's come through anonymous, but if anonymous is on the webinar tonight, if you have additional questions, please just send them through. Paul is always happy to answer a question from the community members. We've got one final question for the moment under this first theme, unless others come through quickly. It's from Vicky Johnson. When you talk about existing and non-existing transmission lines, why don't you mention the existing north-south easement with transmission lines you want to use to reach your proposed North Ballarat terminal station?
Yeah, look, it's a good question, and look, apologies that I didn't mention that in my my last response. There is an existing easement, an existing transmission line that runs from Ballarat to Bendigo, and that is the line that the new terminal station does need to connect into. Within the area of interest and the area that we're investigating to determine the most suitable location for that new terminal station, we are considering the way the 500 and then the 220 kV lines would need to connect. But yeah, look, I do apologise that there is an existing transmission line running from Ballarat to Bendigo that I didn't mention previously.
Thanks, Ash. We're going to move to infrastructure, and looking at the questions, there's a lot of questions initially about undergrounding. I think you might want to get ready, Francisco, and I think a lot of these questions came through during your presentation. So the first one is from Timothy. Is it not true that there are modern underground drilling methods that have a minimum footprint compared with the underground method you are suggesting?
I think this touches on the comments from Ash before on the methodology required to locate or to install this underground cable. Directional drilling, which I think is what they are referring to, may not be suitable for the type type and size of cables that we would be installing in this project.
Okay. I've got a comment here from Mark. There's not a question attached to it, but it says this spin on a trench having more environmental impact is nonsense. A trench will be filled in again, so the impact is temporary. The towers are polluting the landscape forever. There's not a question attached, but if any of you want to respond to that, now is your opportunity, Francisco or Ash, or I can just move on. There's a lot of questions here.
Again, it will be filled in with thermal material, not with the exact same type of soil. And the native vegetation that we would be removing by excavating that trench is not going to be replaced. The cultural heritage sites could not be replaced. So I guess that's my answer.
Okay.
I think the other thing to bear in mind as well is that we would need to have access to these locations for ongoing maintenance activities. So we would, be having to go back and access these areas, so there would be further ground disturbing activities after that initial construction phase.
Okay, one for you, Francisco, specifically. Francisco, please talk about the advantages of an underground line, because there are plenty.
Yeah, there's no visual impact. There's no ongoing visual impact. That's number one. Less impact on birds and bats and avifauna. Some maybe noise. Transmission lines have some noise emissions, quite low and at a limited distance. I don't think I can think off the top of my head of any other advantages that an underground line may have. But we all need to remember that the impact, environmental impact, needs to be assessed on a triple bottom line: environmental, social, and economic. So it's a multidisciplinary assessment that would need to be made. It's not just, visual here or flora and fauna. It needs to be assessed as a whole.
Thanks, Francisco. The next question is, does AusNet have the ability and prior experience to put the lines underground? If not, what grounds are your claims based on? Please show your evidence to the community.
Yeah, so we have experience in underground transmission lines. We have in the cable that joins the desalination plant in Wontagi with the electricity network is owned and operated, and it was built by AusNet Services. There is also an example of a 220 kV, and Dennis, give me a hint here. It's in Brunswick to Richmond.
That's right, yeah. Brunswick to Richmond cable.
How long is that?
You put me on the spot now. I think that's about 20 kilometers.
And we have at a smaller scale, so in the distribution network, we have numerous examples of underground cables, but of a much smaller rating than this one.
Yeah,
and we cannot have an experience of 500 kV underground cables because there are none in Australia, and there are only a few all over the world. 220 kV, we have experience on those, and we have professionals in our company who are experienced in underground cables. Ash, do you want to talk about your knowledge of underground cables?
Yeah, look, I can speak briefly on that, Francisco. As Francisco said, we do have expertise and capabilities within AusNet Services specific to underground cables and the requirements that come with the use of that technology. And look, that does I believe provide us with the ability to understand the construction and the installation requirements, and then talk about the comparisons between the two types of solutions. Yep.
Okay, next question. The line is going via Warborough switching station. Is this merely via the switching station, or will there be works at the Warborough switching station?
There will be minor works to connect the new transmission line. The Warborough terminal station will be disconnected from the existing transmission line and connected to the new one. So those are the works that will be undertaken in that terminal station.
Okay. This is from Joe. Your tender was for overhead lines. Can you renegotiate with the government for underground lines? Can you also supply costings for both?
That is our request that would need to come from the sponsor of the project. It's not our call.
Okay. And who's that? Just to be clear, who the sponsor of the project is, Francisco?
The Australian Energy Market Operator.
Okay. We've got a bit of a statement and a question from Jim Fazy. You continue to quote the lack of examples for underground cables. In 2019, just last year, AusNet changed its published course and put a 220 kV transmission line underground in Mortlake to join the Mortlake South Wind Farm and Terang. AusNet and Acciona laid 15 kilometres of underground transmission line along an old railway line corridor. The width of the trench is the width of an agricultural pipe with a 3 to 4 metre wide track on top. This followed fierce lobbying from Moyne and Corangamite Shire communities. What was the real cost difference for this project?
Now, that is not an AusNet Services project. AusNet Services worked with Acciona in the initial stages of that project, but that cable, we had nothing to do with it. We are not the owners, or we didn't design, we didn't construct that cable. Also, that's a much smaller capacity. It's the same rating, the same voltage, but it's a much smaller capacity. So the amount of electricity or energy that that cable is transporting is much less than what we would be transporting in our project. I was going to make a note, and that's a privately funded project. So that's funded by the wind farm itself, not by this. This project will be funded by the electricity users, businesses, and households in Victoria. So a private entity can do whatever they want with their money, but we are here defending the interests of the electricity consumers.
Thanks, Francisco. We've got it's more of a statement from Leanne, but one of you may want to respond. So it's from Leanne Camp. The Creswick Regional Park is a hotspot for prospectors using metal detectors to find gold. We ourselves run a tour company, Gold and Relics Gold Prospecting Adventures, in this area. However, metal detectors are unable to operate successfully in areas with high voltage power lines. We strongly oppose the placing of the power lines in this area. Did anyone want to make a comment in response to Leanne's statement there?
Dennis, do you know about the impact or the effect of transmission lines in the use of metal detectors?
No, I'm sorry. I'm not across that at all. We would have to take that one on notice, I think, and do some research.
Thanks, Dennis. We've got a comment from Mark. Here is a chance to be innovative as a country and as a company. In 2003, a 500 kV line was built underground over a distance of 40 kilometres in Tokyo. So we'll just leave that one there. That's a very interesting comment from Mark, unless anyone wanted to respond to that.
Again, we would need to check what the rating of that and the capacity of that cable is, and what the reasons were for, Tokyo or whomever is paying for that to make that decision.
Question from Moira. Why do you need to join the Bendigo line?
That was decided by that's a network planning decision. So it was determined that the best way to expand or augment, enhance the grid was in such a way. So that's what we are following.
Thanks, Francisco. Clarification for Stephanie. To clarify from an earlier session, will all non-suburban landholders within the area of interest receive requests for land access to run assessments? If not, does that therefore indicate that the people who are receiving letters are along a preferred route?
Yeah, I can answer this one, Amy. As I've mentioned before, we progressively started sending letters to landowners in areas where we would like to undertake further investigations and understand the areas better. We progressively started that in the west of the project and started working our way in an easterly direction within the area of interest, and we will continue to do that as we gather information, understand the existing environment, the conditions, and as we identify further areas where we need to gather further information, we will continue to send out letters to landowners in those areas.
Thanks, Ash. And while you're in the hot seat, we've got a question specifically for you from Anonymous. Ash, doesn't Powercore have an existing 66 kV easement running south of Balan from Melbourne to Ballarat? Couldn't this be utilised and upgraded? Surely two very large service providers are able to work together to achieve the best outcome for all Victorians and have the least impact, as this easement has already been acquired.
Yeah, look, that's definitely correct. There's a number of distribution and or that particular, whether you want to call it sub-transmission assets within the area of interest. It's important to consider, though, that there is some really important differences between distribution or sub-transmission and transmission infrastructure, particularly 500 kV transmission infrastructure. To ensure and maintain safety, the separation distances between the conductors, between each conductor, or the conductor and the tower, or the conductors and the ground, that distance is significantly larger than what is required for any distribution or sub-transmission infrastructure. So we are aware there are a number of those assets within the area of interest, but there are some really specific considerations that need to be taken into account when you start talking transmission infrastructure, particularly at the 500 kV voltage level.
Thanks, Ash. This is, I think it's directed at you, Francisco. Yeah, it is. It's from Mark. The only ongoing maintenance for underground circuits would be to access link box pits for sheath testing purposes. no further ground disturbance would be required as incorrectly stated. 500 kV underground does not need to be known in Australia, as you state, Francisco. It's known around the world, and we can adopt their system and methodologies. I personally have already provided some examples. Stop trying to play down the underground option. It is possible.
I've never said it's not possible. It's an order of magnitude. It's more impactful, environmentally more impactful. And again, it's the economically sustainable solution. That's my statement. I'm not saying it's not possible, and I'm not saying it hasn't happened in other parts of the world. I'm just saying that the economically, the least impactful from a triple bottom line, social, environmental, and economic point of view, solution is the overhead one.
Okay. Thanks, Francisco. We'll have another couple of questions about infrastructure. There are a lot of questions tonight, so we'll have another couple and then we'll move on to the next theme. So I'm going to go with Vicky, who's got a question. How is this project or sections of this project different to the successful Wonthaggi project? Do you know what the Wonthaggi project is that Vicky's referring to?
Yeah, that's the desalination plant.
Okay. So the question, how is this project or sections of this project different to the successful Wonthaggi project?
Again, the desalination plant project is one that we, in fact, I was wrong before we didn't build it. I think we as AusNet Services, we purchased it, but it was not built by us. It was built by a third party. So the considerations or decisions that were made when the project was, that the decision to underground that project were made were foreign to us, or not, were not decisions that were made by AusNet Services.
Okay.
Francisco, the other point to the desal plant is that underground cable is at 66,000 volts. So it's regarded as a sub-transmission, not transmission. And it was built by a third party.
Thanks for the clarification.
Now, before someone comes then points that I was wrong, I think I said it is 220 before, but I was wrong.
Thanks, Dennis. Thanks, Francisco. Question from Glenn and Barbara. What is the minimum distance a dwelling or outbuilding can be located from the transmission line easement?
Yep, I can answer that one. Thanks, Amy, and thanks for the question. So that relates specifically to the width of the easement in relation to, and I've got them written down so that I get them exact, the easement widths for the 220, depending on the spans between, these can vary. So they are a range, but the 220 kV is expected to have an easement width of 40 to 60 metres, which basically means from the centre line of the pole, 20 to 30 metres either side. And with the 500 kV, we're expecting that will range between 70 to 100 metres. That's 35 to 50 metres from the centre line of the pole. Structures are allowed to be up to the boundary of that easement with obviously some height limitations there, but structures can't be located within the easement.
Thanks, Paul.
Hopefully that answers the question.
Got two more questions from Glenn and Barbara. So I think these will probably be for you, Paul, as well. Can a 500 kV transmission line be built over a sports ground facility?
When you say over the top, there are examples of where transmission lines are above sporting grounds, or at least towards the edges of those. I know Green Gully Reserve I think we have some close by there. I don't know of examples where they run directly over the top, and I think the most important thing to realise there is we'll be trying to avoid those circumstances. When we talked earlier about, you know, the sort of things that will influence the corridor and then refining down to the alignment, and those social sporting grounds would be something that we will try to avoid where possible.
Okay. Lots of questions about infrastructure. What is the minimum distance allowed between a 500 kV transmission line with 80-metre towers from the end of a light aircraft runway? Does anyone have that information?
Yeah, look, I don't have those exact distances off the top of my head. Can definitely take that on notice. Aviation assessments will definitely form part of the planning and approvals process, and those investigations will look to understand the use and operation of aviation facilities or local airfields within the area of interest and potentially proximate to the project.
Thanks, Ash. We're going to end this theme by taking a couple of questions from Vicky. We run a working cattle farm running up to 1,000 head of cattle to produce our world famous brand of Wagyu beef. Our property our property is over the 3 crown allotments are all in the area of interest. Whilst we are totally against this project in its current form, we would like to know. I'll ask the first question and get a response. There's 3 questions in total. What are the impacts on a cattle farm whilst towers are being constructed? Is the first question.
I'll answer that one. It's the impact is very limited to the footprint, construction footprint around the transmission towers. So towers will be in the order of 400 meters away from each other. The construction footprint around one tower will be in the order of, say, depending on the size of the tower, between 70, 80, a 70 by 70 meter square. There will be if required, an access track, temporary access track that would be built to access that construction hard stand. That access track, if required, would be removed after construction, and the hard stand, which may be made up of crushed rock, will also be reinstated at the end of construction. Then once the tower is built, the remaining affected area would be only the square made up of the 4 footings, which I think is a 30 by 30, in that order, 25 or 30 by 30 meters square.
Okay, the next question from Vicky. What studies are there on living and working under 500 kV lines?
Well, it wouldn't be under the line. It would be near the line. We have some resources in the project website about the guidelines for living in the proximity of transmission lines. And again, this is a heavily regulated industry, and we would be building as per the Australian standards, the regulations from ARPANSA, which is the Australian Radiation Protection and Nuclear Safety Agency, all the Electricity Act, the regulation from Energy Safe Victoria. So, and as per the example that I was showing before, there are tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people who live in proximity to transmission lines in suburban Melbourne. Dennis, you want to add anything on this?
Sorry, Francisco was on mute. Yeah, so there is restrictions of dwellings and structures, in fact, near transmission lines, and that's purely a safety concern in terms of close proximity to electrical conductors. In regards to electromagnetic fields, the studies that we've seen and PANSA guidelines, we don't allow any structures to be close enough that they get anywhere near 2000 milligas, which is the measure for EMF. With a house that's outside the easement, it would be down below 100 milligas in terms of EMF, which is quite within the guidelines.
Okay, Another question from Vicky. What is maximum height for agricultural machinery, including tractors driving under the line? Do you have someone to respond to that one? The
Well,
maximum.
Yes, I can provide some information on that. And look, it is a good question. The lines are at a standard where any vehicle that is able to be road registered and transferred on the road without a special permit are able to drive underneath those lines and work underneath those lines. Any vehicle that is outside of that, we would work with the landowner at the time we were discussing easements and occupation at that time. And undertake an assessment to ensure that those vehicles could be safely operated. And this is where we have talked a little bit about the opportunities to ensure that infrastructure is placed to provide the maximum opportunities and maximum ability for people to continue their operations in the way they are currently undertaken.
Okay, one more question about infrastructure, because I think, Francisco, you can provide some clarification because it is directed at you. It is from Ben. Francisco, you specify that the minimum height is 15 metres from the ground, but in your proposal to the Planning Minister and also in the Mortlake original proposal, you specified 9.2 metres. Why are you saying to the community that it's 15 metres?
15 is on the 500 kV section. The 9.2 will be in the 220 kV section.
Okay, thanks for the clarification. It is 7:08. We have just under an hour together. Still lots of questions coming through, which is great to see. And we're going to move on to our third theme, which is bushfire health and impact. How many have we got? Yep, there's quite a few. So let's get started. This is from Mark. The transmission lines are very close to forested areas and cause a fire hazard. Local brigades will likely not be allowed to turn out, as they are not allowed or want to work under high voltage power lines. How are you going to solve that?
Thanks, Mark. Look, in terms of bushfires, we work closely with Energy Management Victoria, Emergency Management Victoria. If a bushfire was anywhere near the vicinity of our tower lines, we will have one of our liaison officers stationed inside Emergency Victoria's headquarters in Spring Street, and dealing directly with the CFA and police and so forth. In terms of firefighters going into our easements, they do go through our easements quite often, but if the fire was to get anywhere near it, we will be turning those power lines off. And that's just a phone call to the control centre, and the control centre will throw the switch and isolate that line.
Thanks, Dennis. Next question, didn't the Cressy 500 kV towers collapse? What measures are put in place to avoid this disaster? The proposed pathway is extremely close to forested areas, very high fire risk.
Yeah, so that the Cressy towers that failed on an abnormal wind event that the state hasn't seen for a few hundred years, and not been recorded before, so that wind event was extreme. So having said that, we're doing forensic studies on those towers to find out exactly what occurred to bring that tower down. Or one tower came down and pulled the others down with it. What we do know is that it was a downdraft onto the tower itself, but we don't know exactly the failure mode just yet, and we're doing the forensics on that, and that will be built into applicable standards to take in that wind event.
Thanks, Dennis. This is from Marianne. Can you address the health impacts of having overhead transmission lines with close proximity to residential dwellings?
Yeah, so as I said before, the health impacts that people are referring to is electromagnetic fields, and the concern around that is when the electromagnetic field is above 2000 milligas, and that's the standard set by APANSA. APANSA is the regulatory body that oversees all of the nuclear and electrical radiation. A transmission line at 500 kV, the milligas will be around about 100, and that is underneath the line. As you get further away from the line, that electromagnetic field gets weaker and weaker. Now, short duration, and when I say short duration, I'm talking about working there for 8 hours. Underneath that is not harmful, and that's proven. Living in close proximity, as long as you're not living directly under the line, which you can't because we won't allow any dwelling to reside under our lines. And in fact, in the easement, and the easement, you must remember, is going to be between 50 to 100 metres wide. So that's the closest a house can possibly get. In suburban areas, you'll see that there is, as Francisco pointed out, has been for generations, houses backed up to our transmission lines and people living in close proximity with no reported health issues. And that's because they are far enough away from that electromagnetic field.
So, Dennis, there's sort of a cluster of questions here around guaranteeing health safety. People asking about, you know, a written guarantee that their children's health won't be affected, or their health won't be affected, or, you know, there's a mention of a 10-year-old daughter who is terrified of being infertile as a result. So there's a lot of stress about this in the community. Do you want to talk just to general sort of health impact? I'll ask one question though, actually. Yeah. It's from Sarah. Have any studies been done in Listerfield South, but I'm going to ask, or anywhere else, looking for any common health issues for those living near power lines, or is it unknown because it is not being investigated?
I don't know if studies have been done around Listerfield or Listerfield South. Generally, studies are generated off the back of an incident that occurred, and so there's no reported incidents that we know of. There has been studies done before in terms of other infrastructure that we have built. We did studies in relation to the Brunswick terminal station that we built, and we commissioned experts in the field to perform studies on the EMF and the effects of EMF. And then how does those studies relate to the APANSA regulations? And there's been numerous studies done across other states and so forth, but Brunswick's the one that I know of.
Thanks, Dennis. This is a question about environmental impact. It's from Stephanie from Wattle Flat. In the event that the WVTNP is not required by the Planning Minister to complete a full assessment under the Environmental Effects Act, what other environmental impact assessments, particularly native vegetation and wildlife, will be undertaken? Please speak specifically as to the process, detail, reporting methods, and how the outcomes of these assessments will be applied to the project. Thanks, Stephanie. Is that you, Tara?
Yeah, it is. Thanks, Stephanie. Thanks, Amy. So under the Planning and Environment Act, we would need to have approval to do any vegetation removal. And as part of that approval, we need to demonstrate that we've avoided and minimised impacts. Any unavoidable impacts after we've gone through that process would need to be offset so that there's a net gain for the environment. So we need to go through that process regardless of the whether or not an environmental effect statement is required. We are also submitting an Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act referral, so an EPBC referral. So that's under the Commonwealth legislation, and similarly, we would need to demonstrate to the Commonwealth that we have avoided and minimised impacts to threatened species, to threatened communities, and also to habitat for those species well as a assessment of any other matters of national environmental significance, but as it relates to our project, that is threatened species and communities. So as part of that process, again, we're expected to demonstrate that we have done everything we can to avoid and minimise impacts. And we would also be required under that legislation to offset those impacts. In terms of other studies, I have actually noted down how many studies just before this session, so I could remember, because I've just counted 13 studies that need to be completed. And again, those studies are required under the Planning and Environment Act. There's also a number of policies that need to be satisfied. So that's under the Environment Protection Act. So there are a large suite of policies and legislation tests that need to be met through the process. Working on waterways or near waterways also requires consents from the catchment management authorities. So there will be a series of consents and approvals required. Heritage Victoria, for example, would require us to assess any heritage impacts and approve those. Again, Aboriginal Victoria and the registered Aboriginal parties would also be assessing the impacts to Aboriginal cultural heritage, and we require their approval too. So it's not only the environmental assessment process that requires us to do those studies, it's also a number of different approvals that will be required for the project, and policies and legislation that need to be satisfied.
Thanks, Tara. Next question is from Olivia. With Victorian agriculture impacted by the Western Transmission Project, how can AusNet guarantee the future viability of farming in the zone of consideration?
I'll take that. Thanks, Amy. So one of those 13 studies that I mentioned is agriculture. So we will be having some experts look at the agricultural impacts. We're also talking to DELP as well, Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning. They have an agricultural assessment underway. So we are waiting to see the report when it's released to the public, but we're also investigating the area to understand where those significant agricultural areas are in our area of interest, so that we can initially seek to minimise and avoid impacts. But as I said, agriculture will be one of those studies that will be completed in more detail over the course of the next 12 months or so.
Thanks, Tara. I've got a question from Anne Wilson. Can you confirm that if you hold a fluorescent light globe under the power lines, it will glow? That's the first part. The second part, also, the electromagnetic field, I think it's meant to start, can the electromagnetic field, could it reach the ground on a foggy, misty day? So I think, Dennis, you're primed and ready to answer.
Yeah, sure. So the short answer is yes. The mercury inside a fluorescent tube can be ionized with a very small field. You would, and it has been done before, but essentially you need a very dark night and the fluorescent tube will glow, but it's not lighting up, it's just glowing. In terms of can an electromagnetic field within fog, yes, it will increase a bit more because you do have moisture in the air. So that's the short answer to that.
Thanks, Dennis. I think this question is also for you. It's from Gerald. How long does it take to turn off the power line if a fire is in the vicinity?
So as quick as a phone call from the Emergency Management Victoria requesting us to turn it off because they have they want to gain access or something. There's also protection systems that will automatically operate and turn the line off should fire get too close to the line.
Okay, thanks, Dennis.
And let me point out that would happen in milliseconds. Is that right, Dennis?
Yes, that's right. And I mean, that I've not known a line to do that. We generally turn it off beforehand, as we know the fire's coming. We're in direct contact with the CFA and so forth, and they're talking us through the whole thing. And we're turning it off mainly to protect our asset.
Okay, a question which relates, it's from Mark. So Dennis, don't mute yourself, get ready. Will the lines be switched off on a total fire ban or a code red day? How long do these transmission lines stay charged after they have been switched off in case of a fire event?
No, we don't turn the transmission network off on a code red day. In terms of how long they stay charged, if they do get turned off, there will be residual current in there, but we're talking minutes that it would stay there, and it's not anywhere near voltage. It'd just be like a battery being stored. Okay.
One final statement and question before we move on to visual impact. If it is so easy to turn the lines off in the event of a fire, and you are not worried about them being affected by the fire due to the height of the towers, which you mentioned in the Zoom on Tuesday, why wouldn't the lines be built through the government state forest north of the area of interest? All landowners could plant trees in strategic locations on their properties as to not affect current farming operations to offset these impacts of loss of forest.
So in terms of planting trees and so forth, we have no problem where the trees are planted as long as they're not inside the easement. And the easement is large enough that the tallest tree cannot contact the conductors should it fall in towards the easement. Did that answer the question? I'm not too sure if I did.
I think it did.
Yep.
If Anonymous would like, or Francisco, did you want to say anything there?
I understand that this friend is suggesting that we build the transmission line across the state forest. Obviously, that would have quite a material environmental impact. That is a possibility, but again, needs to be assessed in conjunction with a lot of other impacts. And we are also conscious that there are some other members of the community that are drastically opposed to that possible solution. So again, we need to assess different possibilities and different alternatives here. There is no clear-cut solution or proposal or alternative that's universally supported by the community. And we will need to assess all those suggestions, proposals, alternatives, possibilities as a whole. Again, environmental, social, and economic impact.
Thank you. One final question before we move on. It's a pretty important question. It's from S. Simpson. Will my husband's pacemaker be affected under the lines when he is working in the paddock? Is that you, Dennis?
Yes. No, he will not be affected.
Thank you. All right, we've got one question that's just come through actually about visual impact. It's from Jim. So I'm going to read it out verbatim, so hopefully it all makes sense. Jim, the project has been referred to the Planning Minister, Richard Wynne. He mentions a cumulative visual impact, which may result in changes to the perceptions of the local community or a visitor to the region due to the presence of multiple transmission lines and or substations in the project area. How are you planning to quantify this impact and what are you proposing to do about it? Is that you, Tara?
It is. Thank you for the question. We haven't had a response yet about the project from Minister Wynne, but we are hoping to get a decision shortly. So we haven't had any specific feedback on cumulative effects, but it will form part of the landscape and visual study. So there's a number of things that we'll look at, including existing infrastructure, cluttering across the landscape, if you like. There's a number of things that need to be assessed, including other projects as well that are in proximity to our project. So cumulative effects will be considered, and they will not be limited just to the landscape and visual impact assessment. They'll be required to be assessed with regards to ecology impacts as well, for example, but a number of other assessments. That's a standard requirement that is included in scoping requirements for environment effect statement, but it's definitely something that we are intending on doing and looking at. In terms of avoiding and minimising impacts, part of the study that will be taking place looks at public places and also dwellings, and assesses the potential impacts to those public places, which could include heritage sites or tourist locations, tourist routes, and also significant landscapes that are noted and acknowledged in different documents and planning schemes. So there's a number of things that need to be included in the assessment. As a starting point, we look at siting the infrastructure to minimise those impacts. So part of that will include the cumulative effects assessment. So yeah, there is a number of things that we do, but initially it's looking at design and placement of those towers to minimise impacts to those public places and also to private dwellings.
Thanks, Tara. There's a couple of questions that have just come through, which are in response to, I think when you were answering a question before, Tara. It's around the agricultural assessment. So I'll read it out. They came in as two questions, but I'm going to wrap it up all into one. Will all landholders be allowed to provide input into the agricultural assessment? Also, will it be conducted by people who understand all aspects of farming, especially intensive farming operations and specialised farming pursuits? Who will appoint the so-called experts in agriculture? Will this be AusNet? Will the Shire or Council have any input? There's a lot there.
There is a lot there, so if I miss anything, please let me know. So the agricultural assessment will be undertaken by an expert that is, familiar with the area and the practices that take place in that area. They are being subcontracted by our principal consultant, who's Jacobs. But part of the other question was, sorry, you might have to help me here, Amy.
Yeah, that's okay. I thought you were going to launch in. I'll go back to the start. Yep. Will all landholders be allowed to provide input?
Yes.
Will it be conducted by people who understand all aspects? So the consultants that are working under Jacobs, are they equipped, and do they understand intensive farming operations and specialised farming pursuits?
Yes, thanks, Amy. So yeah, they are equipped. They are experts in the field and familiar with the region. As I said, landholders will definitely be included in the study, and we want to work with landholders to understand how they operate their individual properties, so that we can avoid and minimise impacts as much as possible. So that could include construction type impacts, so making sure that any cropping activities are factored into our scheduling, so that we can try to minimise those impacts as far as practical. So there is an opportunity at the end of the process as well for peer review, and also for the community and other experts to look at the results of those studies. It will be submitted to government, so that's where the government will get involved. If the project does go through an EES process, the Environment Effect Statement process, there will be a number of agencies and approval authorities that will be reviewing all of these documents. But regardless of that process, it we'll go to state government and we'll be consulting with Agriculture Victoria, Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, particularly around the assessment that they're doing currently around the significant agricultural areas in our area of interest. So we recognise that it is really critical that we get good data from landholders and good engagement. So some of that's coming through the land and easement or the land access agents at the moment as we start those conversations. So we encourage you to tell our land access agents more about how you use the property. But as we get into the study as well, there will be further discussions with landholders to feed into that more detailed assessment. I hope I've answered all parts to that question.
I think you have, Tara. Thank you.
And Amy, sorry, if I could just sort of speak there as well, and I think Tara did sort of touch on the land and access agents and their conversations with landowners, and part of their role is to obviously take that information on board to be able to, you know, speak to landowners about what the operations are on their land. So, you know, obviously there's people that are objecting to the project, and we understand that, and speaking to those guys is a really good way for you to have initial input in, so that we do understand those operations. So really do encourage people to take advantage of that and make sure that they're having those conversations to inform us of obviously their agricultural activities or their use of property and land use in general, because that is really important information for us.
Thanks, Paul. This is a question from Olivia. We've received it via email. Farming land here at Clark's Hill is worth more than the rest of Australia right now because of its unique soils and rainfall. But after these towers go in, the entire district will be forever scarred and devalued. But you are only compensating those who house a pylon. How is that fair? That you, Paul?
Yes, it is. Look, the compensation to landowners is limited to people that have an easement on their property, and it's not just the pylons. Obviously, it's the wires traversing over property as well. Compensation isn't payable to people outside of that corridor. It is directly related to the easement and the interest that we're acquiring in land. I can't comment on the equity about that. It's the Land Acquisition and Compensation Act, and the way that that compensation is structured across all projects of this nature, and there is legislation that relates to that. So I think, as we said, it does specifically relate to the acquisition of the easement or an interest in property.
Thanks, Paul. The next question is from Malcolm Mill. As the preferred route choice is narrowed down, how would impacted landowners be advised that their land was in the preferred final route? And will they be required to give permission? Paul?
Yeah, I think there's two matters there. In relation to that, we would want to converse with landowners directly about that, I suppose, before you know, further information is available. So it will be communicated to landowners individually if we want to discuss further. And obviously that does go in a couple of stages where we're coming down from the area of interest down to a broad corridor and then down to an alignment through that planning process, and narrowing of that. With those conversations will be had as we go along. In relation to there, we are seeking to negotiate easements and land tenure with landowners. That's a strong preference we have, and being able to do that, we talked about before, understanding people's operation and their use of the land, and there is the opportunity to be able to ensure that infrastructure is placed to minimise any disturbance to existing operations. When we talk about that alignment, once we've reached that, that's because of extensive studies to work out where the line would be located to minimise impacts right across the entire project corridor. And where you've got an impact in one location, to mitigate that might cause a lot of impact in other areas as well. So that final alignment will be based on an alignment that causes minimum impact across the entire corridors that we're looking at. So I think we've discussed previously that we've got that desire to negotiate all of those easements. I think there are going to be locations where landowners just don't want power lines there. In those circumstances, obviously, we've discussed whether that would be voluntarily acquired. If we're unable to do that, then we would have to look at statutory powers that may be available, but that does require us to also make an application to be able to compulsorily acquire, and that is a separate process all over again.
Thanks, Paul. Question from Emma. In the previous session, you said you have identified a percentage above market value that you will pay for compensation to ensure consistency over properties. What is that percentage? If purpose truly is to ensure consistency and fairness, the community must be allowed to know it.
Yes, that's something that we will be discussing with individual landowners, Amy, as obviously we enter into those discussions. And they will be treated commercially confidence with each of those landowners. It will be based on valuation, and that valuation does take into consideration a lot of factors in relation to the land, but they will be obviously discussions we have with each individual landowner.
Thanks, Paul. This is from Joe. Some people have been approached with a $500 voucher so you can obtain access to their land. If they do not accept the voucher, your representative said, we will have a letter in 10 days' time to say they can access their land without their permission. Is this true?
Touching on that, and I've sort of mentioned that a little bit, obviously, in relation to accessing land, obviously, when it comes to easements. But at this point in time, I think it's important for people to realise that what we are doing is studies at this point in time. It doesn't commit them to having power lines on their property. We are looking at properties that maybe are joining on to other sensitive areas, etc. And our investigations are going to be over quite a broad area to narrow down to that corridor and then down there. So I do encourage people, we are looking to work with people to enter into voluntary agreements to be able to there. In relation to the $500 vouchers, those are being provided people just to say thanks for working with us. It isn't meant to be in any other thing above and beyond that. In relation to there, when we do get to the point where if studies have to be done, then once again, there are powers that are afforded to electrical infrastructure providers. It's not our preference to do that, but if it is critical and it has to be assessed in order for the project to be able to understand those impacts, then once again, we will have to explore those opportunities.
Thanks, Paul. Okay, we're moving into community engagement where there's quite a lot of questions. We have about 20 more minutes. So the first questions, when should landholders expect to be contacted by land agents? We had a meeting and they said they would be in contact. However, it has been many weeks and there has been no further contact. Is that you, Ash?
Yeah, look, I can definitely start to answer that question, and Paul, if you could assist as well. As I mentioned, the strategy or the approach for determining and engaging with landowners has been progressive, and the landowners within areas that we would like to understand in greater detail, we are making contact. We have sent letters and are following up via phone calls and other communication, potentially face-to-face meetings as well. It is just worth noting that with the current COVID-19 situation and circumstances, that does place some limitations on the abilities to communicate and engage with landowners within the area of interest. And we are conscious that in these current circumstances, not everyone is comfortable. We can take that question on notice and follow that one up. But we are intending to follow up with all landowners who have received letters with a phone call and with further communications. Not sure whether, Paul, you can add anything to that as well.
Yeah, look, we discussed earlier that it is a really broad area of investigation. I think at this stage, we've reached out to, I think it's probably approaching 500 landowners at this stage. and that will be expanded on. So there is a huge amount of people to for the land agents to have those discussions with. I know that at this stage, I think we're approaching about 300 of those people that have been spoken to on the phone. I think we're somewhere around about 250 meetings that have had face-to-face with landowners. It is a really big task to obviously get out there physically to everyone. I know that the letters that people may have received or communications will have a phone number there, and there is dedicated land agents that are to manage that process, and those contact details are provided with each of the communications that go out to landowners. So if you've had a meeting, obviously the land agents may be focusing on progressively working through and making sure that everyone's been spoken to. But they are available on phone if you need to speak to them. If you've had a meeting, obviously you've been introduced to one of them already. Feel free to reach out to them if the communications aren't there. At this stage, their role specifically is to speak to and introduce the property, the project, should I say, and discuss, the environmental surveys, the cultural heritage surveys, and those sort of things that we're looking to do, and assemble that base information to help us refine down to a project corridor. So once again, really do suggest to people reach out to them, make sure that you're having that exchange. If they haven't contacted you yet, please feel free to reach out to them. Everyone will be spoken to. It is a huge quantity of people, and they're doing their best to reach them in a timely fashion.
Okay, thanks Paul, and thanks Ash. We've got a question from Moira. Why weren't the timeframes extended due to COVID-19? Who would like to speak to that one? Is that you, Ash?
Yeah, I can speak to that one. So in terms of engaging for the project, we are seeking to continue engaging with the community, and making sure that as we do engage and as we do communicate, that we are doing that in a way that does align with the social distancing requirements and other state and Commonwealth requirements and restrictions. We are, and we will continue to engage with the community. We are available via the phone, via other online communication processes, and also we're suitable and we're appropriate for face-to-face communications as well. So we are genuinely interested, and we genuinely do want to engage and understand the concerns and the values within those local communities.
Thanks, Ash. Questions from Emma. Does AusNet have access to maps of all existing utility easements on private land, or does it need to look at titles of each property? Even if the existing easements aren't wide enough, properties with existing easements are less likely to object and will suffer less loss of value. Is that you, Paul?
I can comment on that. In some circumstances, we are doing title searches to obtain that information. We are working with all of the other local authorities, etc., to work out infrastructure locations and easements that are associated with that. Remembering once again that those easements are designated for a particular type of infrastructure, so we can't occupy that as well necessarily. So we are gaining an understanding of all of that infrastructure, and as Ash said earlier on, if they're in the area of investigation, we're seeking to understand that and look at how we can work around those things to come up with an alignment that causes a less impact.
Thanks, Paul. We've got a couple of questions from Melissa Thompson. Do landholders have to sign consent to be consulted in the agricultural assessment? When will compulsory acquisition commence? Or before or after the assessment, before or after route selection? What are the timelines for this process?
I think it's important to understand that with compulsory acquisition of easements, we are that occurs under Section 86 of the Electrical Industry Act, which requires us to make an application to the Governor and Council for assessment. In order for that to be certified, we have to show, obviously, that there's certain requirements and that we have an alignment that is the lowest impact alignment and that we've got the right thing there. As I said, our preference really is to negotiate these easements. It does give us much more flexibility in how we locate the infrastructure. It really allows us to understand, working with landowners, how we can minimise impacts, and it is by far the preference. But that application for compulsory acquisition wouldn't be considered until we have an approved project as well. I think that's important to realise, that we would have gone through these assessments, the community consultation and all those things before that would be progressed.
Thanks, Paul. We've had an email from Damien, and this is about stakeholder community engagement. I have been reviewing your website today, which has a link to early stakeholder engagement overview. Within this linked document, it states that letters to potentially affected landowners were sent in April 2020. As a potentially affected landowner, we received a letter on June 12th, over 2 months after it has been stated in this document. If we had received letters in April, I can guarantee that the opposition to this project would be far more advanced than where we are currently at after just 1 month of notification. Why are AusNet falsifying dates relating to community engagement in this report for DELP? Who's the best person to respond to that one?
I'll touch on that, and I think, you know, Ash did say that we commenced obviously liaising and reaching out to landowners starting out at the western end of the project, and those letters did commence going out in April, and obviously that's been a progressive exercise working through from the western end, and we're progressing down through, and I think we're, you know, right through till the Sydenham terminal station, which I'll say is the end point of the project. So that is progressively going out. So yes, some landowners may have received those in June. I don't know the exact dates when you know, the last lot of communications would have been sent. We have found that, you know, with Australia Post at the moment, there's also some delays there. So, you know, but obviously that's a couple of month gap. So I won't say that it's Australia Post. But, you know, we have progressively moved down along there. So that would account for some of that delay. I think we have said that we're progressively sending those letters.
Ash, did you have anything to add to that, or Paul's got his facts right?
No, Paul's covered off everything there.
Great, thanks, Paul. Okay, I have got more questions. We have an email from Vicky. When you post the recordings of all of the sessions, will you also be posting a transcript of each session? Your consultation cannot be considered to be comprehensive or meaningful if the hearing impaired cannot access the content of any and all sessions. I am sure the Disability Act would have something to say about this as a necessary means of providing access. So Ash, have you got a response to Vicky's clarification requirements?
Yeah, thanks, Amy. Yeah, in addition to the recordings from these Q&A sessions, we will be also including a comprehensive compilation of all the questions that have been asked, along with the responses that have also been provided, and that will be available on the website. Again, just to enable as many people to access the content and the discussions that have occurred over the duration of these 6 Q&A sessions.
Thanks, Ash. Got a question here, or statement in question from Gillian. It's not really to do with community engagement, but that's okay. It's come through on that theme. So in the literature circulated by the project, it is stated on the front page that the project route will avoid townships and areas of cultural significance and threatened ecological species. There is current evidence in the private forest areas of Bulwarra of at least one animal on the Victorian threatened species list, the powerful owl. Why have landowners in this area been sent letters of interest which seem to indicate that their land is on the route, when a route through here would result in destruction of the habitat of this and many other native species? Is that you, Tara?
Yeah, I can take that one. So we actually do have a number of threatened species and communities across the area of interest, so that they're not isolated to one area. And what we've committed to is assessing all of the values, the environmental values, threatened species and communities, social values, visual and landscape impacts, and really look at all of that collectively, and to make a route selection choice based on, you know, the best outcome for the environment on balance of considering all of those factors. So we have committed to doing what we can to avoid and minimise impacts to threatened species and communities. We, under different legislation, state and Commonwealth legislation, we are required to demonstrate that we have avoided and minimised to the greatest extent practical. And any of those unavoidable impacts would need to be offset. So there is quite a process to get through, and an approval at 2 approvals at the end to actually impact on any threatened species and communities.
Thanks, Tara. We've got a question. This one's about planning, zoning, but it's quite specific. It's from Richard. Our land is zoned green wedge with the limited permitted uses. Is this a one-way restriction? We pay for the land and pay a premium market price at the time with the zoning at the time. Can WVTNP ignore this Victorian planning green wedge zoning?
No, yeah, it is. Thanks, Amy. So there's a number of, obviously a number of zones and overlays across the area of interest that need to be considered. So green wedge is one of those. There are particular uses that are allowed in green wedge, including utilities, and, you know, other major projects such as quarries. So while it is something that is considered, and along with other overlays and zones, to make sure that we are also minimising impacts and making sure that where possible, we're positioning the landscape as close to other compatible land uses as possible. There is acknowledgement that these areas do need utilities, and we need to have this infrastructure housed somewhere. But yeah, it is one of many planning zones and overlays that that are assessed as part of the assessment.
Thanks, Tara. Okay, this is a whole paragraph I'm going to read out. It's from Gillian. It's about community engagement and future community engagement. So Ash, get ready. Okay. There are many residents and landowners in our area who, for a number of reasons, will not be able or willing to join these meetings. Some people do not have access to good internet. Some are unaware of these meetings, and some may not be comfortable or confident with this format, to name just a few. I appreciate that COVID-19 has presented big challenges, but we demand a greater level of community participation than what has been done online. I would like to know what arrangements beyond Zoom meetings and the invitation through newspapers to contact the project the WVTNP will make to ensure that real community consultation and information can occur. Many people feel like this is being snuck in under the cover of current health restrictions. What will you do to address these fears? I think it's you, Ash, but it might be Francisco, but yeah.
Look, thanks for the question. We are continuing and will continue to look at a whole range of engagement opportunities, engagement methods. Obviously, we're utilising online communication and engagement, but we'll continue to explore the use of print materials. So sending out we can look at sending out project fact sheets or postcards, which we have done previously. So we'll continue to explore opportunities for print-based communication, along with looking at the ability for further engagement via online platforms. But we do also encourage people that would like to engage face-to-face and are comfortable to engage face-to-face to please get in contact with us and let us know. because there may still be opportunities for those sort of engagement practices to occur. So, but we definitely will continue, and we do understand that people prefer to engage in different ways. So we understand that, and we want to ensure that we, as much as we possibly can, cater to as many landowners, as many people within these communities, and provide opportunity for them to engage with the project and with AusNet services in a way that they are comfortable with, and enables them to have discussions regarding the Western Victoria Transmission Network project.
Thanks, Ash. We're going to have
I'd like to point out, Gillian, if you have suggestions, ideas about how we, given the current limitations that we are subject to, what are potential avenues or channels that we could use to undertake that engagement that we haven't thought of or proposed before, please let us know, and we will look at implementing them.
Thanks, Francisco. So we're going to take questions from 2 more people and then we'll finish up. So this is from Melissa Thompson. What happens if landholders do not agree to assessments being conducted on their land? What actions will be taken to forcefully enter landholders' properties to conduct assessments? What will the timelines be? Is that you, Paul?
Yeah, I think it sort of covers part of what obviously my role is, but I think there are probably some broader questions there as well. You know, I think it's important for people to realise that those assessments, once again, that it's not, you know, people saying, yes, put the power lines on my property. It is allowing us to go in and understand the sensitivities there, to understand the land use and understand, you know, the potentially protected flora and fauna that we need to understand. That's why we're seeking access to properties. To get that understanding is very, very important. And, you know, we need to understand if we may be potentially impacting, so we could potentially mitigate or avoid that impact. So, you know, the second part, one moment, I have to cough, excuse me for a second.
Mute. Yeah.
Sorry, my apologies for that. You know, in relation to, you know, accessing onto land, you know, the various different studies are required in different locations. So, you know, we've talked about whether it's understanding visual impact from people's properties, it's looking at cultural heritage, it's looking at flora and fauna, it's looking at a range of things, and also understanding that land use, which is why we want to engage with people. There's a distinct benefit to people doing that so that we can garnish that understanding. And obviously, I think that's really, really important. You know, there's some of those studies we've talked about have to be done. You know, we are trying to work collaboratively with landowners, and there's a mutual benefit there to us gaining that understanding. You know, I think we have said, and we've put it up on our website, that our goal is to negotiate that access and potentially down the track land agreements for easements, which comes further down the track. But if landowners, you know, if those studies have to be done to make a proper assessment of the project, there are statutory powers available to electricity infrastructure providers. I touched on those earlier on, and you know, we would explore those if it's a critical path activity that has to happen, that we need to obtain access to particular sites.
Thanks, Paul. You're free to cough now, so you can mute. Final question from Anonymous. When will these sessions and all the questions asked via the platform and all other platforms be made available to the public for review? Is that you, Ash?
I can talk to that if you like, Ash.
Yeah, thanks, Dennis.
Yeah, so we'll be collating the online sessions, and we hope to get that up on the website over the next few days. The transcripts that we spoke of, we'll have to correct those because it's software that's reading our voice and misinterpreting words. You know, they'll use it, probably say things like, if I say down, it says done. So we have to just correct that, and that's a fairly laborious task. It's 6 2-hour sessions of speaking that we'll have to correct. So that'll take, I'm estimating 1 or 2 weeks to get through that, because it's us individual panel members that will have to actually correct the wording, because we're the ones that said it. But they will marry up to the online sessions. And also what we're going to do is embark to do a compressed version of the online sessions, taking the key points, the key questions and answers, put them together into one single video as well. So you'll have the 6 online ones, and you'll have one single cut down version, because I don't think everyone wants to sit through another 6 hours of this. I hope that answers the question.
12 hours, Dennis.
Yes.
Thanks, Dennis, for the clarification there. We're going to finish up. It's 2 minutes past 8, and I'm sure you've got other lives that you want to re-attend to. I would like to say a very, very big thank you for all your participation over these 6 webinars, all of the community members that have been involved, for your thoughtful questions and statements and follow-up. It has been quite incredible, and I hope that we have built your understanding around what the project is and what it is not. I'm sure you've all been to the website. There'll be a whole lot more information on that website next week. But thank you again to the panelists for being here tonight. That's 12 hours of webinar for you, so that's probably enough for this fortnight for now. So thanks everyone again, and we'll see you soon. Good night.